안녕하십니까?
Good afternoon.
저희 패널에 안 좋은 날씨에도 불구하고
Thank you
와주신
for
모든
joining
여러분께
us despite the
감사드립니다.
wet weather.
이 패널은 북한의
This is session
비핵화와
3-2
국제 협력을
titled
주제로
North Korea's Denuclearization and International
논의를
Cooperation.
하는 그런 자리가 되겠습니다. 먼저 간단하게 통역 관련 안내를
First and foremost, I would like to make some housekeeping announcements. Please set your receivers on channel 3 for Korean and channel 4 for English.
Please press 4 on your
Simultaneous interpretation is provided throughout the session.
그러면은 간단하게 Q&A 세션
Now,
관련해서도
I would like to briefly tell you about the Q&A session as well. We will hear from the presenter and four discussants, which will be followed by a Q&A session. Please raise your hand, and we will hand you the microphone if you're here in person. And we also have many online participants. If you're joining us virtually, I'm sure that you will see a link, and please access that link and leave your questions there. And you can see this on YouTube.
자, 그러면 참석자 소개만 간단하게.
Now I will briefly introduce the participants.
발표를 맡으신
First and foremost, we have with us Professor Kier Lieber.
지금 이제 밥 저비스나 케네스 월츠 같이 이제 이미 타계를 하신 원로
Actually,
학자들을 제외하고 현역 중에
other than professors who passed away, he is actually the star scholar in this field about nuclear deterrence and nuclear strategies, and he is an eminent scholar in this field, and he is a professor at Georgetown University. He works at the Center for Security Studies. He's the director of the center, and there is also the security program, the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, which is the top center, and he's the director of that center. Yes, well, he is a prominent scholar. I want to re-emphasize that. And we have four discussants. We have two discussants from the Unification Policy Studies Division of the Korea Institute for National Unification, which is a co-organizer of this session with the Korea University Peace and Democracy Institute. We have Director Kim Sang-gi, who is the director of Unification Policy Studies at KINU. We have also a research fellow, Jung Sung-yoon, who is a research fellow at KINU. So, junior compared to Kim Sang-gi. And we also have with us Alexandrova, Professor Alexandrova. We also call her Dani. She's a research professor at Korea University Peace and Democracy Institute. Thank you very much for your hard work in organizing today's session. And last but not least, we have Professor Baek-sun Woo from the Graduate School of International Studies at Korea University. And she is also a member of the Peace and Democracy Institute at Korea University. Now let us save time and get started with the presentation and discussion. Without further ado, I would like to hand over the microphone to Professor Lieber.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I too want to save as much time as possible for a discussion. So I will go through my presentation beginning immediately. Again, the question here is North Korea's denuclearization and international cooperation. The message of my talk is that there's unlikely to be much denuclearization, and international cooperation is problematic, particularly the U.S. extended deterrence commitment to South Korea. So I don't bear good news, but I am happy to be here. I'll very quickly run through my main arguments. I'll focus on the two main problems. I'll discuss some potential solutions. I'll discuss some counter-arguments, and then I'll conclude quite quickly. First of all, the main argument is that North Korea's growing nuclear capabilities are eroding the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrence guarantee to South Korea. The fundamental problem is that North Korea faces major incentives to escalate to nuclear use during a conventional war. I'll discuss this in 1 minute. There's an exacerbating problem. It's that North Korea's nuclear capabilities are growing, specifically its ability to target the United States homeland with nuclear missiles. Most of the alternative proposed solutions will not work. And I'll try and leave time to discuss why I think that's the case. And that leaves one alternative option, which is an independent South Korean nuclear arsenal. And that may be the only rational path forward. Let me be very clear at the beginning. I don't see this as a positive development, but when I work through the logic of the problem, it's the best of the worst solutions. So what is the fundamental problem? The fundamental problem is that North Korea needs nuclear weapons. It understands that it needs nuclear weapons. So I want to talk about the logic of why North Korea would use nuclear weapons in any scenario. The most obvious scenario is having to do with nuclear escalation during a conventional war. What's the problem here? And again, I'm certain that many viewers and audience members understand this basic problem, so forgive me for being simple. But it's important to understand first and foremost that the United States and South Korean forces, the Combined Forces Command, is far superior to North Korea in conventional military power. That means that if there is a conventional war on the Korean Peninsula, Combined Forces Command is going to win, and win very quickly. This is not going to be a long, drawn-out conventional war if it occurs. Yes, North Korea's artillery threat to South Korea is a problem, but under almost any conditions, a conventional war is going to go very poorly for North Korea. Understanding that, you understand the incentive that Pyongyang has for Kim Jong-un to reach for the nuclear sword for the purpose of stalemating CFC conventional military superiority. Again, conventional imbalance of power in CFC's favor will lead North Korea to strongly consider nuclear escalation to prevent that conventional defeat. There are a lot of different scenarios in which North Korea uses a nuclear weapon. It might be simply a demonstration detonation on its own territory. It might be a detonation in the East Sea against a ship or out in the wide open water. Or it might be a strike against the port at Busan. It might be a strike against Kadena Air Force Base in Japan. You choose the form of escalation, but the key to any escalation is the threat of what is to come, the threat of future escalation, unless the Combined Forces Command cease military operations and allow the North Korean government to survive. You might think this is a crazy strategy, nuclear escalation, and maybe Kim Jong-un is irrational enough to do it, or delusional enough. But what I want to emphasize is the rationality of this strategy. And the reason it might work, for one thing, is that it's been the strategy of other states and other alliances in a similar position in the past. Make no mistake, US strategy in the Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviet Union was to threaten nuclear escalation to deter the Soviet Union from conquering Western Europe. This is the exact same strategy. Conventional weakness leads to powerful incentives to escalate to nuclear use for the purpose of stalemate. That logic is found elsewhere around the world today. In Pakistan, Pakistan's nuclear strategy, because of its conventional inferiority, is to use nuclear weapons to halt the war before it's too late for Pakistan. If Russia escalates, it will be because of the same reason. They're losing a conventional war with NATO, perhaps in Ukraine, and decide that that is an existential threat to their survival, and they use nuclear weapons. So history supports this logic. Contemporary nuclear doctrines support this logic. And perhaps the most important reason to understand why this strategy might work is that it leaves the United States and South Korea with only bad options to respond to nuclear escalation. Let me ask, if North Korea uses one nuclear weapon, kills hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 people, and threatens to use more unless the Combined Forces Command stop the conventional war, what is likely to be the response? All of the options I can think of are terrible. Number one, you could accept a ceasefire and just cave to North Korean nuclear escalation. That might be the best option, but it's going to set a dangerous precedent and possibly encourage more proliferation to other actors, to South Korea itself. Options number 2 and 3 are also not very palatable. You could immediately retaliate with nuclear weapons against Pyongyang, punish Pyongyang for what they've done. I've heard South Koreans advocate for this. I've heard American policymakers advocate for this. But unfortunately, that will kill millions of people and, most importantly, perhaps not eliminate North Korea's ability to use a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth nuclear weapon if they've pre-delegated authority to do so. You could ignore it and continue the campaign on Pyongyang, but again, not going to do anything to eliminate the threat of future escalation. And then finally, you can try and disarm North Korea once it's crossed the nuclear threshold with nuclear weapons, with conventional weapons, with cyber, with anything possible to disarm them from escalating, but you may not succeed. Weapons 2, 3, 4, 5, et cetera, may still be used. And your own counterforce strike may kill millions of people alone. All grim options, which is why nuclear weapons and nuclear escalation is a rational strategy. Simply put, nuclear weapons are excellent tools of stalemate, and that's why North Korea wants them, because it needs to create a stalemate in a conventional war against the Combined Forces Command. The second problem, and I'll be briefer here, is that North Korea's arsenal is growing, qualitatively growing. Most importantly, in the past, the threat of North Korea's nuclear arsenal to the United States was the possibility of strikes in the region against regional forces, causing thousands of deaths, right? Soon, threat of thermonuclear missile strikes against the U.S. homeland, causing millions, several tens of millions of civilian deaths. That is a qualitative difference. That is a meaningful difference for the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence. I simply put to you that the United States and U.S. leaders are going to find it very difficult to credibly commit to risk the destruction of Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C. to protect South Korea. What are the solutions to this? Maybe we should ramp up conventional military buildup. Right? You often hear it, to show our commitment to the Republic of Korea. The problem with this solution is that that's only going to exacerbate the imbalance of power. Right? Remember, it's the conventional superiority of the Combined Forces Command that leads North Korea to use nuclear weapons. So building up conventional power wouldn't seem to solve the problem. What about bringing nuclear weapons back to the Korean Peninsula in the South? Forward deployment of U.S. nuclear weapons. Again, this does not solve the fundamental problem, which is that it is the United States that has its finger on the nuclear retaliatory trigger. Whether those weapons are on the peninsula or offshore or even back in the United States doesn't change the fundamental problem that the credibility of our willingness, the U.S. willingness to use those weapons, no matter where they are. Third, maybe we could do something that NATO did, a nuclear sharing agreement, where the Republic of Korea has a say, perhaps has some control over nuclear weapons. The problem here is that nuclear sharing is not nuclear sharing. Even in NATO, it was only a very brief period in which West European allies could potentially have used nuclear weapons without authority of the United States. I see no scenario in which the United States would allow South Korean officials to decide whether or not to use nuclear weapons. So nuclear sharing isn't a feasible option. And that leaves an independent South Korean nuclear capability. Let me just say this. What's the problem with South Korea developing a nuclear arsenal? There are many problems. Again, I am not saying this is a wonderful solution to a wicked problem. One argument is that South Korea can't afford condemnation from the international community and from the United States and isolation for its decision to develop a nuclear arsenal. And my response to this is that everyone should go read Article 10 of the NPT, which provides for the possibility of withdrawal from the NPT with 3 months' notice in cases in which a sovereign nation has determined that circumstances threaten its security, supreme emergency, whatever you want to, however you want to describe it. It's not difficult for me to see that in the face of North Korean threats to destroy your country, that you would have a legitimate claim to withdraw from the NPT. Second, often you hear the argument that South Korea's decision to acquire nuclear weapons is dangerous because it will create a window of opportunity, a period of vulnerability before South Korea can deploy nuclear weapons in which North Korea will attack. My response to this argument is that North Korea is deterred currently from invading the South because of the conventional imbalance of power. All that would be happening would be that a South Korean nuclear arsenal would be replacing a U.S. nuclear arsenal as a retaliatory threat, as a deterrent. And I would submit to you that that is a much more credible deterrent than the threat of U.S. nuclear forces in an age in which the United States is vulnerable to North Korean extortion. I will conclude there, actually, to make sure that we have time to hear from the discussants and for Q&A. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 리버 박사님. 주제 발표를 간단하게 하시기로 했습니다. 그래서 나중에 이제 Q&A 시간에 더 많은 질문과 코멘트를 듣고 좀 인터랙티브하게 디스커션을 진행하기 위함입니다. 자, 이제 네 분의 디스커선트의 발언을 들을 텐데요.
Now we will hear from 4 discussants. I will give 7 minutes each. Please be punctual so that we have more time for the Q&A session. First, we have Mr. Kim Sang-gi.
예, 안녕하세요. 통일연구원의 김상기입니다.
Thank you very much. My name is Kim Sang-gi from Kino.
교수의 이제 그 주장을 잘 들었습니다.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Professor Lieber.
핵무장을 하는 것이 필요하다.
So nuclear armament is key in Korea.
몇 코멘트를 좀 하려고 하는데요.
And I would like to make a few comments.
좀 몇 가지를 좀 전제로 하고 있는
So I think
거고요.
that
하지만 이제 제가
your
그
statement
발표를
has a
들으면서
few preconditions
들었던 생각은
and
그
assumptions.
전제들이 좀 타당한가라고
And
하는
I would
좀
like
의문이 좀
to pose a question
있었습니다.
about the
우선 이제
validity
리뷰 골수의
of the assumptions.
한국의 핵무장 필요성
You
주장은
talked about the
첫째,
armament of
북한이
South Korea.
핵능력 신장으로
And number
인해서
one, while the
북한이
DPRK
군사적
is
분쟁을
increasing
도발할
its nuclear
가능성이
capabilities and it can rev up
증가했다라고
its
하는 것을 전제로 하고
provocations.
있는데
So
이 얘기는
that
이제 아까
was
이제
the
리버 교수의
hypothesis.
이제 발표 중에서
And during your
재래식
presentation, you
전쟁
talked about the
상황에서
conventional
북한이
warfare
핵무기를 사용할 가능성이
and the possibility of the
매우
DPRK using
증가한다.
nuclear weapons
증가했다.
is increasing,
이런
has
주장을
increased.
하셨고 그 재래식 전쟁은 우리
And
한국과 또는
the
미국이
conventional
먼저
warfare,
개시하는 게 아니라고 한다면
it's
북한이
not
먼저
triggered
개시를
by
하는 이야기를
Korea and the
하는 거기
US, so I
때문에
believe that
이런
it's triggered
전제를
by the
이미 대표하고
DPRK.
있다라고
So I believe
볼 수
that
있고요.
was
그리고
the
두 번째는
hypothesis. And number two,
북한의 핵무기가 억지
the
능력을
DPRK's
넘어서서
nuclear
남한에
weapons,
대한 강압, 다시 말해서 컴플런스를 위한
it
효과적인 수단이 된다라고
can
하는
be
것도
a
전제로
means
하고 있는
of
것 같습니다.
compulsory
하지만 저는
means
이 두 가지
that goes
전제에
beyond
좀
deterrence.
비판적인 의견을 좀 드리고
And
싶습니다.
I
우선
have a
첫 번째로
different view.
이 첫 번째 전제인 핵능력의
First,
신장이 군사적 분쟁 도발 가능성을
the
증가시키는가라고
increase of
하는
nuclear
것은
capabilities,
그것은
does
반드시
that
그렇다고 보기
strengthen
어렵고
military power?
논쟁적인 주제라고
I don't think there
생각을
is a correlation there.
그동안 여러 이제
It's
그
subject to
학계의 여러
dispute.
경험적인 연구
And based
결과들도
on the
그
research
어떤
outcomes,
국가의 핵무기 보유 또는
the
핵능력의 신장이
possession of nuclear
그
weapons
국가가
or the
군사적인
development
위기를
of
촉발하는
nuclear
행동을 할
arsenal
가능성을
does
증가시키는가에
not
대해서
increase
그렇다 또는
the risk of nuclear war.
단정하기 어려운
So
혼재된
we
연구
can neither say
결과들을
yes
제시를 하고
nor
있습니다.
no.
특히 예를 들어 가지고
So
그
that was
벨과
the
밀러의
result
2015년
of the previous
연구
studies.
같은 경우는
So if you look at the
현재 이제
2015
남북관계
study of
상황하고
Belgar,
비슷하게 어느
just like the
한쪽이 핵무기를
inter-Korean
보유하고
relations,
있고
well, if there is
보유하고
one
있다고
side with
하더라도
nuclear weapons, and
상대방이
even
다시
if
말해서
that's
우리
the case,
남한이죠.
if the
남한이
other
그
side, so
상대방이
that is
재래식
South
군사력이
Korea,
우월할 경우에는
if the conventional
핵
warfare
보유국이
capability is
군사적
superior,
분쟁의 개시자가 될 것 같다는 경험적 증거가 없다라고 하는 매우
there is a no
실제로
around
우리
to
이제
say
국방부에서에
that
따르면 국방부에서
this
자료에
one
따르면
side will be
북한의
the one
핵능력이 크게
holding
그
nuclear
신장이
weapon
되는
will trigger
2010년대
warfare.
이후에
So
북한의
after
대남
2010,
국지 도발이
North Korea
격화되었다라고 볼 수
wrapped
없고
up its
그런 증거가 없다는
provocations,
거죠.
but
특히 이제
not on
2018년
the
이후에는
ground, especially after
2020년까지
2018.
북한의
So
대남
up to
국지 도발은
2017,
단 한 건밖에 이제 기록되지
there is just
않고 있습니다.
one
따라서
provocation that happened on the
북한이
ground
핵능력 신장으로
from the
인해서
DPRK.
북한의
So they
북한이
increased
군사적
their nuclear
분쟁 도발을 할
capabilities.
가능성이
However, that does not
커졌다라고
mean
하는 전제는
that there is higher
오류일
possibility
수 있다. 이렇게 좀 저는
of
생각을
war
하고요.
from North Korea.
두 번째로 북한의
And number
핵보유
two,
또는 핵능력 신장이
North
북한의
Korea's
대남
nuclear
강압 능력을 신장시키는가
ability,
하는 것도 저는 반드시 그렇게 보기는
well,
어렵다라고 생각을 합니다.
you talked about another
요거 관련된
correlation,
최근에
but
연구들이
I
또
have a different
있는데요.
opinion,
그
and
특히
I've
예를
seen
들어서
recent
그 세셔와
research on that.
퍼만의 그
If you
2017년
look
연구
at the
같은 경우는
2013 research of Sesher and
일반적으로
Perman,
핵무기가
so
억지력, 그러니까
in
핵무기가
general,
억지력
if you have
강화에는
nuclear
매우
weapons, of
효과적이지만
course, it's
강압 능력을
very
증가시키지는
effective in
않는다라고 하는
strengthening
경험적
nuclear
연구 결과를 제시하는데요.
deterrence.
다시 말해서 핵무기가 디터런스 하는 데는
What it means is
효과적이지만
that nuclear weapons is
컴펠런스에는
effective
효과적이지 않다.
for
이런
nuclear deterrence,
얘기인데요.
but not
그
for
이유는
compellence.
이 핵무기가 가지는 이제 두 가지 한계에
So
기인한다는
what
걸
it
볼 수
means is
있습니다.
that
첫째,
while it is
핵무기의
driven
실제적인
from the
사용은
limitations of nuclear
핵무기를
weapons.
실제적으로 사용을 했을 때
So let's say that
강압을
you use
통해서
nuclear
확보하고자
weapons
했던
and
목표들은
you use
어떤
coercion
이득마저도
or you use it
파괴하게
forcefully,
되는 그런 결과를
and
초래할 수가
that
있고
defeats
두 번째는
your
어느
initial
국가든
purpose.
간에
And number
핵무기를
two,
실제로
no matter
사용을
what country,
한다면
if you
받게
are to
되는
use
군사적인
nuclear
반격
weapons,
그리고
then
국제적인
you
제재와
will
어떤 비난
receive
이런 것들이 상상을
counterattack
초월할
from the other
정도
side,
수준이
and you
됩니다.
will also
따라서
receive criticism from
핵무기
the
사용을
international
통해서
community.
얻을 수 있는
So
이득이
the benefits
손실을
that you can
초과하기
earn
어렵다.
from using
그렇기
nuclear
때문에
weapons cannot
핵무기가
exceed
실제로
the
사용될
laws.
수 있다라고 하는 가정하에서
So that means
양자 간의
that
교섭이 이루어지기 어렵고
Well,
따라서
we
핵무기는
cannot
강압을 위한 효과적
engage in
수단이 되기
negotiations
어렵다라고
only
하는
because
것입니다.
one side
이것도 이제
has nuclear
실제로 예를
weapons.
들어서 이제
So,
가장
for
최근에 그
example,
남북
let's
간의
say
국제적
that
충돌 사례라고
if you
할 수
look
있는
at the
2015년도
recent
비무장지대
2015
목함지뢰
DMZ
사건 당시에 이제
mine
북한은
incident?
남한에 대해서 핵무기 타격 위협을 가한 바가 없습니다. 오히려
North Korea
당시에
did
어떤
not
상황이
strike
생겼냐면은 오히려
South
북한은
Korea with nuclear
남한의
weapons.
요구를
What happened was
수용하면서
this. The
목함지뢰 사건에
DPRK
대한 유감
accepted
표명을
the
합니다.
offer
북한이
from
이제 그
South
유감을
Korea
표명하는 경우가 상당히
and
이례적인 건데
expressed
아무튼 이런
regret,
상황들이
which is unusual.
있었고, 그러니까 이러한 어떤
So
이제
that
논리적
happened
근거라든가
back in
사례를 통해서
2015.
보았을
So
때
if you look at
북한의
the
핵무기가
cases of the
남한에
past,
대한 강압을 위한 효과적 수단이 되기는
the
어렵다라고 좀
nuclear
얘기를 드릴
weapons
수가
of the
있고요.
North cannot
그리고 이제 그
be
북한의
used as a
우리
coercive
한국의
tool
핵무장
to pressure
필요성
South
주장
Korea.
자체에
And
대해서도
the need to
이
possess
우선은
nuclear
좀
arsenal
현실적이지가
in
않다라는
South
좀
Korea,
얘기를 좀
I
드리고
do not
싶습니다.
think that is
우선 이제 뭐
feasible.
국제적 동의를 받기가
It will
어렵고
be
그리고
difficult
이제
to
뭐 제재라든가 우리
gain
한국이 이제
international
우리
support
핵무장을
and
추구를 하게
agreement.
되면은
And if we
한국이
were
받게 될
to
이제 제재,
go
지금
with
북한이
a
갖고 있는
nuclear
제재를
armament,
생각을 하면
then
뭐 생각하기
if you look at
쉽겠죠.
the
이런 문제들
sanctions
여러
that
가지로
North
이제
Korea is
봤을 때
subject
우선
to, we won't be able to
현실적이지가 않은 문제가
avoid
좀 있고요.
the sanctions. So it will
그리고
not
그
be easy for
우리
us
한국이
to build
핵무장을 추구를
nuclear
하게 되는
arsenal.
순간 이제
And
비핵화를 더 이상
once we
요구하거나
decide to
주장하기가
go
북한에
nuclear,
대해서
then
비핵화를 요구하거나
we will have
주장하기가
no ground
어렵게
to
된다. 왜냐하면
convince North Korea to
우리가 핵무장을
denuclearize.
추구하면서 북한한테
So we cannot pursue
비핵화하라는
nuclear
모순된
weapons and
요구를 할 수가
tell North
없겠죠.
Korea to abandon its
그리고
nuclear
또
weapons. That does not
그러니까
make
리버
sense.
교수는 이제 한국이
And the
핵무장을 할 때
professor
오히려
talked
평화를 가져올
about
수 있고 핵
how
군축도 용이해질 수 있다라고
arming ourselves with
주장을
nuclear weapons can
하시는데
bring
이
peace.
부분에 대해서도 저는 좀 공감을 하기가 어려운데요.
I cannot fully
한국이
agree
핵무장을 추구할 때
to
오히려
because
한반도에는
if
핵
Korea
군비
was to go
경쟁이 발생할
nuclear,
가능성이 더 높고
then
한반도는
we
지금보다 더
may risk
평화롭지 않은
seeing
오히려 더 불안정
a nuclear
상태로
arms race.
접어들 가능성이
And
상당히 있고
the
한반도를
Korean
넘어서서
Peninsula
지역
will
차원에서도 우리 한국이
unstabilize.
핵무장을 추구를 하게
And
될
if we
경우에
were to go
연쇄적인 효과, 다시 말해서
nuclear,
일본도
then
핵무장을
it will
추구를
cause
한다라든가
a
이런
domino
상황들이
effect. Like,
생길
for instance,
가능성이
Japan
상당히
would want to go nuclear
있다. 그렇기
and
때문에
so forth.
한국이
So that
핵무장을
can
하게 될 경우에
be
그것이 이제
a
평화를
possible
촉진하거나
result.
또한
So
이제 뭐 핵군축을
it's
용이하게
hard
되는
to
핵군축이 용이해지는 그런 상황으로
think
가기가
that
어렵다라고
going nuclear
생각을
will bring
합니다.
peace on the Korean
이
Peninsula.
우리가 핵무장을 추구할 때
Now, if
북한이 핵
we are to
능력을
go nuclear,
신장시키고자 하는 동기는 오히려 더 증가할 것이다.
then we will
생각을
only
합니다. 이제 그렇기
push
때문에
North
이제
Korea
한국
to further
핵무장은
develop its
실질적으로
nuclear
여러
arsenal.
가지를 뭐 얘기를 드렸던 것처럼 현실적이지가 않을 뿐만
I
아니라
do not think
한국의
that
평화에
idea
매우
is
반하는
feasible.
이런
And it
결과를
goes
초래할 수
against
있다.
the idea of
이렇게 생각을
peace
합니다.
on the Korean
이상입니다.
Peninsula. That would be all for me. Thank you very much.
좋은
Yes,
감사합니다.
thank you very much
자,
for
다음으로는
that
우리,
discussion. Next, we will
정성윤
hear from
박사님 말씀
Dr.
들어보겠습니다.
Jung Sung-yoon.
박사님.
네, 방금 소개받은 통일연구원
As
정성윤입니다.
introduced, I'm Jung Sung-yoon from the Korea Institute for National Unification. I would like to thank Professor Lieber for his presentation. I would like to share my thoughts on his ideas. I am with a state-run research institute. So I would like to reflect some of Korea's policy directions. As everybody knows, North Korea's nuclear threat to Korea is increasing. And as such, there is more motive for South Korea to develop its own nuclear arsenal and for the U.S. to use tactical nuclear weapons. And whether this is right or wrong, or whether it's effective or not, there are voices that raise the need for this. And I think that this is separate from the actual policy making. building nuclear arsenal and introducing tactical nuclear weapons is deploying or introducing strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula. So from the Korean government perspective, depending on different criteria, we need to look at this issue. So we need different viewpoints, if you will. First of all, I think we need to keep in mind the necessity of a strategy. If we are to build a nuclear arsenal, if we are to introduce a tactical nuclear weapon, we have to think about whether it will have the desired outcome. And we will also have to think about the timing and the process and the order. And we will also have to think about the political, diplomatical backlash. And we will have to take a look at this comprehensively. And even if all these criteria are met, if owning nuclear arsenal is a very difficult issue, so we have to look at, even then, we have to look at different alternatives to building our own nuclear arsenal. Inclusion, building nuclear arsenal, deploying U.S. tactical nuclear weapons. When we take into account the level of threat from North Korea, is not a very urgent matter. But if a decision is made regarding this matter, the repercussions will be very big. So we still need to remain very cautious. Despite this fact, there are experts such as Professor Lieber and others who are discussing this matter.
중국의 적극적인 대북 제재 견인 측면에서
And these discussions, I think, will actually have an impact on strengthening the extended deterrence provided by the U.S. and strengthening North Korea's sanctions on the part of China. But at the end of the day, this is a military security issue. And so we have to carry out a thorough evaluation. And I think the most important issue with regards to building our own nuclear arsenal is whether it really does have the deterrent effect that we want. If there is such an effect, I think that there might be such an effect.
확장 억제력, 미국의 확장 억제력만으로는 낮출 수 없고 지극히 힘들다라는 것을 전제로 하고 있는데
the premise of building our own nuclear arsenal is that the U.S. extended deterrence is not enough to prevent nuclear escalation from North Korea. So I think that we have to look into this premise and we need to take a look at it objectively to see whether it is true.
한국 정부가 결기를 가지고
the Korean government
보복을 북한에게 천명하고 거기에 따른 핵 전략을 마련하고
would have to build a nuclear strategy and it would have to engage in communication and it should also be credible in telling North Korea of nuclear retaliation. And I don't think any government in Korea will be able to politically take on this challenge of building a credible nuclear arsenal and then communicating that message to both the home audience and North Korea. If we are to build a nuclear arsenal or bring in tactical nuclear weapons, I believe that North Korea might attempt to strengthen its own nuclear arsenal as a deterrent.
한국이 보유한 핵 능력에 대한 선제 타격
North Korea might actually feel the need for a preemptive nuclear strike if South Korea should build its own nuclear arsenal, and we need to hear expert opinion about this matter as well. And there is another issue. If both Koreas own a nuclear arsenal, then at one point in the future, as predicted by Professor Lieber,
있다면
there
그
could
가능성은
be a
높은지
possibility toward mutual
그를
nuclear
통한
disarmament, but we have to take a look at how high the possibilities are and how high the possibilities of complete denuclearization will be through this process.
북한이 공이 핵무기를 가지고 있으면
If the two Koreas
핵무기
both own
감축에
nuclear
대한 협상이
arsenals,
벌어질 가능성을 배제할 수는 없습니다.
of course, there is a possibility that there will be
역사적으로 볼 때
negotiations for nuclear disarmament. But if you look at history, since the 1970s, U.S. and the former USSR held very lengthy nuclear disarmament talks.
양측의 미사일 방어 체계의 적절한 균형도
They
필요할 텐데
not only talked about the nuclear weapons, the talks also dealt with rebalancing the missile capabilities of the U.S. and the USSR. But if you look at North Korea, their conventional military and their missile systems are not that developed.
상호 핵군축 이외에 주한미군 철수라든가
And so there is not much for them to reduce in balance with South Korea. So it is highly likely that they are going to demand a withdrawal of USFK or other demands. So I don't think that we will be able to keep the talks confined to simply nuclear disarmament. North Korea will require South Korea to take additional measures to make up for the fact that it does not have the conventional forces to reduce. And I would like to add one more point before I close my comments. We need to also think about the U.S. perspective. If the U.S. builds nuclear arsenal, or if South Korea builds its own nuclear arsenal, if it introduces tactical nuclear weapons, the U.S. willingness is actually essential. The U.S. is currently has the capability to respond to North Korean nuclear escalation to its mainland. If North Korea advances its nuclear weapons, if North Korea has more capabilities to strike the U.S. homeland, we're not sure
북한이
if this
선제공격으로 미국의 핵 보복 능력을 제거하는 것이
will lead to the desired consequence of events. The U.S. has a great retaliatory nuclear striking capabilities, and even if North Korea decides to strike the U.S. first, the U.S. does have a retaliatory strike capabilities which will be maintained for a long time, at least for the time being. Next, we will hear from Dr. Alexandrova.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation, Professor Lieber, and thank you for the introduction, Professor Lee. So Professor Lieber explained that North Korea's growing nuclear capabilities may erode the credibility of U.S. security assurances to South Korea. And I mostly agree with this assessment and share the view that we need a realistic take on the threat from North Korea. If the sense of insecurity in Seoul increases, many people are likely to be convinced by the argument that an independent nuclear capability may be the only effective way to guarantee South Korea's security. However, my view is that for South Korea, the costs of building nuclear weapons will outweigh the benefits for three main reasons. First, South Korea may become less secure if it has to rely solely on its own nuclear arsenal for protection. As the United States is likely to oppose South Korean nuclear weapons, the US-ROK alliance may weaken significantly if so chooses to pursue nuclear armament. And this means that South Korea will have to depend completely on its new, limited, baby domestic nuclear capabilities for security. However, whether these capabilities can provide the same level of security as that offered by the world's best conventional and nuclear forces is debatable. And to begin with, nuclear weapons are not particularly useful, and they're not particularly effective in protecting secondary state interests, such as, for example, maritime roads. And in addition, as already mentioned, neighboring states are very likely to be very vehemently opposed to South Korean nuclear armament. And this may lead not only to international isolation with very high economic costs, but also to greatly increased regional tensions and the potential full-blown nuclear arms race. And as a result, in addition to North Korea, South Korea may find itself having to deter a couple of great powers with very advanced nuclear arsenals. And achieving sufficient deterrent capability in this case will be very costly at best, impossible at worst. The United States, on the other hand, can both help South Korea defend its secondary national interests and also provide a robust nuclear deterrent guaranteeing survival even against great powers. And my second reason is that the idea that South Korean nuclear weapons can contribute in some way to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula may be overly optimistic. I believe that Pyongyang is unlikely to be satisfied by a mutual disarmament agreement with Seoul as long as its main enemy, which is the United States, continues to present an existential threat to the regime. So thus, South Korean nuclear armament and the proposed later mutual disarmament, it does not seem to address the fundamental problem that makes North Korea cling to its nuclear weapons. And risking to repeat Dr. Kim before me, at the same time, South Korean nuclear weapons might amplify North Korea's paranoia by increasing its perception of threat. Therefore, they are more likely to cement North Korean conviction that nuclear weapons are essential for its own survival. And the third point is that the threat of escalation during military confrontation with North Korea may be overly inflated. Professor Lieber stated that, quote, "The fundamental problem is that North Korea faces major incentives to escalate to nuclear use during a conventional war. In reality, however, despite all the rhetoric, so far neither North Korea nor the United States have demonstrated a strong inclination to fight a war against one another." So put differently, while the threat of escalation during conventional conflict may be very real, the likelihood of war itself is a matter for speculation. I believe here my view overlaps with that of Dr. Kim again. And further, even in case of war, even if war were to happen, the threat of Pyongyang intentionally using nuclear weapons in a first strike against the United States, it is not credible because the retaliation would be devastating. And as Pyongyang cannot be reasonably certain that Washington will not escalate further, either deliberately or by mistake or by error, it is unlikely to risk initiating a nuclear war, which it is certain to lose, not when it may have other options, such as inflicting sufficient damage to the United States using conventional means. So to sum up, developing nuclear weapons may make South Korea less secure than it is now, while failing to achieve the aim of denuclearization of North Korea. And as Dr. Chung said before me, further research and realistic estimates of the negative consequences of nuclear armament are absolutely essential before committing to a policy course which may turn out to be a very costly and high-risk gamble. Thank you.
네, 다니 박사님 감사합니다.
very
매우
much,
정리를
Danny,
잘해서
for
발표해
that,
주셔서
discussion.
감사합니다.
Thank
자,
you very
마지막으로
much.
우리 백선우
Last but not
박사님
least, we will
코멘트를
hear
듣겠습니다.
from Dr. Pekson.
네, 감사합니다.
Yes,
리버
thank you very
교수님
much.
좋은 발표 감사합니다.
Thank you very much,
리버
Professor
교수님
Lieber, for the
발표를
great
간단히
presentation.
정리하면 북한의
So
핵
to sum up your
능력이
points,
증대됨에 따라
as
한국에
North
대한
Korea
미국의 확장 억지
increases
신뢰성
its
약화가
nuclear
매우 우려되는
capabilities,
상황이기 때문에
then
한국이
there is
자체적으로
concern
핵무장에
over
나서야 될
weakened
필요성을
credibility
강조해
of the
주셨습니다.
U.S.'s extended deterrence
이런
in
주장에
South
대해서 저는
Korea.
다음과 같은 세 가지
And,
의견을 드리고자 합니다.
Hence, South Korea should
먼저
build its own
북한의 핵
nuclear
능력
arsenal.
증대가
I would like to give
반드시
3
미국의
comments
확장
on this
억지를
argument.
약화시키는지에 대해서 말씀드리고자 합니다.
First, I would like
리버
to
교수님은
look at the
북한의 핵
correlation between the
능력이 증대된
DPRK's
사실,
increased nuclear
특히 미국
capabilities and the
본토 타격
credibility of the
능력이
U.S. extended
향상되었다는
deterrence.
이유로 인해서 한국에 대한 미국의 확장 억지 신뢰도가 크게
You said
약화되었다고
that the increase in
주장하십니다.
Pyongyang's nuclear
그러나
capabilities, especially
북한이
the ability
미국을
to hit
타격할 수
the
있는
U.S.
능력이
mainland has
향상되었다는
greatly
사실이
damaged the credibility of the
반드시
U.S. in
한국에 대한
providing
미국의
extended
확장 억지
deterrence in
신뢰도를
South Korea.
떨어뜨린다라고
However,
볼
the
수
fact that the
있는지
DPRK has
의문입니다.
improved its ability to strike the
이
U.S.
핵 동맹국,
does not
즉
necessarily
한국의
diminish the
적대국,
country's credibility for extended deterrence. In
얼마만큼의
South Korea,
군사력을
this is
보유했는지가
because the
이
level of
미국이
military
이
power
핵
possessed
동맹국
by the
확장 억지를
adversary,
얼마나
North Korea,
신뢰하고
of a non-nuclear ally, South Korea, is not a factor that determines the reliability of extended deterrence. And there are many factors that we need to consider to look at the level of extended deterrence. The strategies and also the relationship with allies, and by safeguarding that ally, what economic benefits we can obtain, and the level of military action that we can take against the adversary, that is North Korea. So the fact that North Korea's nuclear capabilities increased and it now has the ability to hit the US mainland, that is just one factor out of the many factors that determine the level of extended deterrence. So the two are not that closely correlated. And if that is determined by the military power of the adversary during the Cold War, then not much extended deterrence was provided. At the time, the Soviet Union had the ability to strike other countries, and at the time, while the US was under grave threat. But as we know, the extended deterrence for the NATO alliance of the US stayed firm and robust during the Cold War. So the level of extended deterrence was very high. And we did not see any nuclear attack from Russia. And it is true that North Korea's nuclear capabilities increased. However, that level does not reach that of Russia's level during the Cold War. So that was my first comment. And number two is about the reputation cost. So the reputation cost of the US went up as North Korea's nuclear capabilities increased. If a nuclear state fails to keep its promises of extended deterrence to its non-nuclear allies, the nuclear state pays reputation cost. However, the reputation cost of nuclear allies will increase as non-nuclear allies face greater security threats. So this is because if a non-nuclear ally faces grave threats, but extended deterrence is not provided, the reputation of the nuclear state as an ally will be further damaged. So the fact that the DPRK increased its nuclear ability and poses increasingly serious threat to the national security of South Korea, but if US fails to commit to extended deterrence, the US's reputation will be seriously damaged. The weakening of the US reputation will soon cause major setbacks in the US foreign policy, which seeks to contain China based on its alliance network. In fact, Biden has kicked off many multilateral alliances and networks to contain China. This is a factor that undermines the national interests of the US, so Washington will not weaken extended deterrence on the grounds that Pyongyang is accelerating the build-up of its nuclear capability. So that is my second point. And my last point is with respect to China. China's retaliatory measures can increasingly violate South Korea's security interests. South Korea's attempt to arm itself with nuclear weapons has the potential to increase the possibility of conflict with China, making South Korea's security unstable. So China is extremely wary of the situation in which South Korea's nuclear armament prompts Taiwan and Japan to follow suit. Therefore, South Korea's nuclear armament will trigger strong opposition and sanctions from China. South Korea experienced a similar situation when it deployed THAAD. China identified South Korea's deployment of THAAD as a serious threat to its national security and implemented strong economic retaliatory measures against South Korea in the tourism sector as well as economic sector. And in 2017 alone, 8.5 trillion was lost because of that retaliatory measures. And South Korea's nuclear armament will have a nuclear domino effect, which will be perceived as a greater security threat to China than that, meaning that China will impose tougher sanctions on South Korea. So Korea will experience damage from those retaliatory measures. Of course, it is common sense for us to look into the possibility, the option of arming ourselves with nuclear weapons, but we really need to be careful given the views of the neighboring countries and the landscape in the region. Yes, thank you very much for that discussion. Now, I would like to give the microphone to Professor Lieber for his answers. You've received many questions, and they also raised differing views. So I guess it won't be easy for you, but Professor Lieber, now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I enjoy a challenge, so thank you. I appreciate the criticism. I really do appreciate all of the comments. It shows that you have obviously been thinking about these issues before any of my comments, but that you also took my comments seriously. I guess what I'll try and do, rather than address every single comment by my critics, I'll say a couple things in general. First of all, I think this is exactly the kind of debate that should be taking place. A decision for South Korea to develop a nuclear arsenal would be a momentous decision. It would have a huge impact. It would transform the U.S. ROK alliance. It would potentially have major implications internationally and certainly regionally. And I certainly don't, given the brevity of my discussion, I wouldn't want to suggest that I don't take this to be a very serious issue. Unfortunately, none of the criticisms have offered an alternative to the problem, right? As I said, for South Korea to consider an independent nuclear arsenal, that is the least bad option facing two fundamental problems. And I would invite my fellow panelists to offer the alternative to these problems. And just to be clear, there are two problems. The first is the challenge of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Okay? My response to that is there is almost no realistic solution to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Let me be very clear. I do not see a South Korean nuclear arsenal as a solution to eventual denuclearization. My point was that it's at least as good as any of the other options, right? One could imagine a day when both there's parity of nuclear power on the peninsula, and given a change in the animosity in relations, you might imagine a mutual drawdown and perhaps elimination of nuclear weapons. But I don't think that's very plausible or realistic. I just know that absent any change, North Korea is not giving up its nuclear weapons. As long as it faces a conventional imbalance of power and the prospect of losing a conventional war, it needs nuclear weapons. It's the same reason almost every country has acquired nuclear weapons, is because of this conventional imbalance of power. So that's problem number one, is denuclearization. The second problem is if there is a conventional war. And my colleague is correct. It doesn't matter to me who begins this war. I don't know how it begins. I'm pleasantly surprised to hear that at least one of the discussants thinks that the prospect of conventional war is pretty remote. I tend to disagree. I fear that there'll be another provocation, maybe an accident, inadvertent. It's just not that hard to imagine a shooting war on the Korean Peninsula beginning. It doesn't matter if the US starts it, if South Korea starts it, or if North Korea starts it. Once there is a conventional war, that war is going to go extremely poorly for North Korea, and it will face an existential threat. All of this discussion about whether North Korea, would prefer to use nuclear weapons or can they use it coercively or compelled, ignores the fact that they are facing the same fate that Saddam Hussein faced, that Muammar Gaddafi faced. If you lose a conventional war, it's going to be a very bad outcome. I see no scenario in which North Korea is defeated in a conventional war in which Kim Jong-un and his family and friends survive, or survive in any condition that would make allowing that to happen palatable. Nuclear weapons are a great tool of stalemate. You're correct, not compellence, but in a conflict in which you're losing and you're going to die, nuclear weapons are going to be very useful. Again, those are the basic problems that I don't see any good solutions to. And an independent South Korean nuclear arsenal at least might do one thing, which is bolster deterrence. So let me just make a couple quick points just to make sure people understand my view and ask my colleagues to tell me if they disagree. First of all, nuclear deterrence works well. Nuclear weapons are the greatest deterrent ever created. The problem here is not about the capability, US nuclear weapons versus North Korean nuclear weapons. It's not an issue that deterrence doesn't work. It's about credibility. And I'm simply positing that a South Korean nuclear retaliatory force is a more credible deterrent than a US nuclear force as North Korea's capability grows and grows and as the US becomes more vulnerable. I thought it was curious that Mr. Kim began by suggesting that North Korea has become more peaceful and less aggressive because after it acquired nuclear weapons, but that if South Korea acquired nuclear weapons, it's going to lead to a world of instability and conflict and war. I think everyone needs to decide whether they think nuclear weapons are a great deterrent or not. I think they are a great deterrent as a capability, but you need the credibility to do so. The comparison that I believe Danny made with NATO nuclear deterrence is a good one. Ms. Park. But the argument is that, hey, we had the same problem in NATO and the Soviet Union never attacked. But ask yourself, what did it take to succeed? The United States deployed 7,000 nuclear weapons all over Western Europe, all over Germany, deployed forward deployed forces, right? We had a vital interest in deterring a Soviet invasion and conquering of Western Europe. I believe that South Korea is a great ally and a good friend, but I'm not sure that the United States has a vital interest in fighting a conventional war against North Korea that could go nuclear. And don't take my word for it, take the word of the American people. I think the next president of the United States, regardless of who it is, and I hope it is not a repeat of a former president, the credibility of our commitment is going to be undermined by American sentiment, which is not a willingness to trade major American cities to protect Seoul. Another point, North Korea is already building up its nuclear arsenal. That's happening. So the notion that South Korea developing a nuclear arsenal is somehow going to provoke North Korea to building more doesn't make sense to me. They are proceeding. They are developing greater capabilities, increasing numbers, trying to make their arsenal more survivable, perhaps developing thermonuclear weapons. This is already happening. Again, what's your solution to prevent that from happening or address that? I think I'd like to reserve the right to come back to anything. There are just a number of very good points. All I would simply say in the end is, what's a better solution to this problem? If you agree that a conventional war is possible, and that in that conventional war, North Korea will be losing, that nuclear weapons are a great tool of stalemate. They're not very good for blackmail or coercion, but in terms of coercive nuclear escalation, it seems like it would present very bad options for us, so it makes it a rational strategy. You tell me where I'm wrong so far. If we want to disagree about a South Korean nuclear arsenal, I agree, it's complicated and would be very difficult. And it's even difficult for me to imagine how the United States helps manage an independent South Korean nuclear force, because I think part of it is we have to be on the same page. We would have to agree to this and maintain our presence here in part to deter North Korea from attacking, or China, et cetera. But you tell me where the logic is wrong, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
네, 점점 재밌어지는데요. 네, 이 한국은 토론 문화가
Yes, it gets more and more interesting. I believe that Koreans are now tense because they're not used to this kind of debate. But this is, what we do in debates. So now Professor Lieber talked about his point of view. Now, out of the 4 discussants, anyone who would like to refute, maybe? Yes.
It's not really a refute. I would like to add my thoughts on Professor Lieber's argument. I think there are 2 basic premises to your argument. First is that if war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula, it is likely to start as a conventional war, and the likelihood of a war breaking out because of a nuclear preemptive strike is quite low. I think that is the first premise. And the second premise is that we need to take into consideration escalation. And it seems that you think that the escalation will not be intentional, but rather unintentional. So if these are the 2 premises, the thought that comes to my mind is that the current extended deterrence provided by the U.S. may not be enough to contain the threat of escalation by North Korea. And the second is, if there is unintentional escalation, I believe that is a premise, if Korea has its own nuclear arsenal, at a certain stage of escalation, it could trigger a preemptive strike by North Korea. So I think those are my two questions/comments to Professor Lieber.
Thank you. Just to clarify, no, my view, and maybe, I don't know if it's a translation issue or not, my discussion of North Korean escalation is an intentional, deliberate, rational strategy, not inadvertent. It's not a mistake, not an accident. Because again, that makes sense. It was US strategy in the Cold War. Many countries today have that same doctrine. And there is no other good option for avoiding the worst outcome for North Korea, which is conventional defeat and the end of the regime of Kim Jong-un. So it would actually be quite intentional, quite rational. And again, I know what that sounds like. Here in the United States, we constantly are referring to Kim Jong-un as this crazy, irrational dictator. And I worry about that too. He may be delusional, crazy, and dictatorial, but the point is you can get to escalation through rational logic, not accidental escalation. I think a North Korean preemptive nuclear strike against either US forces or South Korean nuclear forces is highly unlikely. Again, I think that nuclear weapons deter nuclear weapons. Nuclear deterrence works pretty well. The problem comes in with deterring conventional war and nuclear escalation in the midst of conventional war. So again, one thing I just have to say to all the audiences that I speak to, when I talk about US nuclear weapons and US grand strategy, it's not US nuclear weapons that threaten our adversaries. I don't believe that China is afraid of US nuclear weapons as an aggressive, offensive, capability, or North Korea, or Russia. It's US conventional power and our still superior conventional power that provides the threat, to which nuclear weapons are a potential solution. Again, you would prefer to have conventional parity of power, but in a world in which that doesn't exist, nuclear escalation is credible itself, is rational, because there's no good response to it.
네, 제가 여기다 좀
Yes,
따라서 하나
I would like to make a comment.
다니 박사님께서
So, well, Danny actually made a comment on this, the coercive nuclear escalation. So there is a conventional war, and then the US-ROC alliance, and well, now they want to stop the war. So what they do is they do a warning shot, be it Busan or the East Sea. But the problem here is that, let's say that the warning shot strikes Busan, then will the U.S. Stay calm, given its reputation, and it also needs to save face? So maybe it's not Pyongyang, but maybe Wonsan or Hamhung could be a location where we strike. And will North Korea stay calm and do nothing? Maybe it will strike back and strike Incheon. And what about the ROC-US alliance? Cheongjin could be another hit. Then it will start to escalate. The war can escalate, as Dr. Chung mentioned. So we cannot exclude the possibility of a nuclear war. Then there is a problem. So with weak conventional war, now North Korea turns to nuclear weapons, but then its nuclear arsenal, is it better than that of the US? Of course, in conventional war, well, North Korea is inferior, and it is also inferior when it comes to nuclear warfare as well. Then why would North Korea continue with its provocation and rev up its provocations?
Yeah, excellent. And I meant to reply to Danny's point here. And another way I would phrase it is, why would the criticism is, why would North Korea turn a losing conventional war into a losing nuclear war, right? I understand that is a compelling logic, but if you think about what the US response would be to a relatively low-level nuclear escalation, let's just say it's a detonation over the East Sea that doesn't cause any casualties, or something worse, right? It's not clear that the United States would be willing to go up the escalation ladder. It's not clear to me that we would immediately strike Pyongyang with a nuclear weapon, right? It would be highly incredible that the United States would respond to that lower escalatory step by massively escalating a nuclear war. Again, it's a question of what's in America's vital national interest. And fighting a nuclear war with North Korea is not in our vital national interest, right? The difference between a South Korean nuclear deterrent and a US nuclear deterrent is, as I've said from the beginning, I find a South Korean nuclear deterrent more credible. Just to give you an example, you know, the United States in NATO in the late 1940s and 50s and late 50s contemplated allowing West Germany to acquire nuclear weapons, right? The West German government was interested in this. We did not want to spend the money or deploy the nuclear forces to do what was eventually necessary to deter the Soviet Union. So discussions went very far about West Germany being given its own nuclear weapons and the United States washing its hands and going home. There was huge sentiment for that. We eventually didn't do that, in part because the Soviet Union said, heck no. The Berlin crisis was in part caused by tension over this, and it's also the case that Western European countries didn't want Germany to have nuclear weapons, so it didn't happen. But this is not it's not a new development that the United States would consider an ally being allowed to proceed with a nuclear arsenal if it meant that it didn't have to bear the weight. There's one angle, if I can also just add, on the China issue, which is interesting and fair. And the question here is, you know, if South Korea acquired nuclear weapons to deal with the North Korea problem, would this lead to the U.S., you know, end of the U.S.-South Korean cooperation when it comes to containing China and China's aggressive ambitions in the region, frankly, which are focused on kicking out the United States? I think it's important to understand that South Korea and the United States still share an interest in balancing against China and keeping China's hegemony in Asia at bay. And it's not clear to me that a South Korean independent nuclear arsenal means the end of that cooperation. Again, countries pursue their interests, and they can have multiple interests, and sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. So I don't see it as an end of the American presence in Asia, East Asia, maritime, Western Pacific, in part because many of China's neighbors still have a vested interest in balancing and preventing Chinese hegemony in the region.
네, 아주 좋습니다. 자, 디스커선트들 우리 토론자분들 혹시 리스폰스 하실 거 있으십니까?
Does anybody from any one of our discussants want to share their thoughts? I think this is in a slightly different topic. North Korea says it's developing nuclear weapons because of a U.S. military threat. They say they're developing nuclear weapons for their own security. So they're saying that the U.S. is the problem, not South Korea. So that is the North Korean perception. And Professor Lieber mentioned if South Korea builds its own nuclear arsenal, they may be ultimately arrive in a position where they can engage in mutual nuclear disarmament. Of course, you did not say that there was a high possibility of this, but you did mention the possibility of mutual nuclear disarmament. From North Korea's perception, I think North Korea would want nuclear disarmament with the U.S. And will the U.S. agree to nuclear disarmament talks with North Korea? Is this a realistic approach? I mean, is this a realistic thought? And so I'm skeptical about that point, so I would like to hear what your thoughts are, Professor Lieber.
Thank you. Of course, it's not realistic that the United States would engage in nuclear disarmament talks one-on-one with North Korea, because the United States has other reasons to have nuclear weapons that have nothing to do with North Korea and our extended deterrent commitment to South Korea. The difference is South Korea would have one reason to have nuclear weapons, which is the possession of nuclear weapons by North Korea. There's just a clarifying logic when you have two adversaries that the sole reason they possess nuclear weapons is because they face that adversary. You can begin to imagine a bilateral nuclear disarmament future. Again, I think it's highly unlikely. The world would have to change in many important ways for that to ever happen. But just realize that North Korea has nuclear weapons. I would argue not because the United States has nuclear weapons. They have nuclear weapons because that's the guarantee of their security, because of the conventional imbalance of power. Again, countries acquire nuclear weapons more often because they face a conventional threat. And there's no other way to counter that, not because they face a nuclear threat. It's just a common misconception. In terms of the North Korean perceptions that U.S. nuclear weapons are the problem, again, I just disagree with that. I recall after Gaddafi fell in the Libya campaign, murdered, right? Lost power and was murdered. The North Korean news agency released a statement, and it said something to the effect of, if anybody needs a better example of why countries like North Korea need nuclear weapons, they should look to Libya. And of course, Libya abandoned its nuclear aspirations in an agreement. And what resulted was Gaddafi being displaced from power and killed. Okay? The U.S. State Department released a response that for once made the North Korean news agency look like a rational, reasonable, calm kind of response. The U.S. response was, oh no, the Libya conflict had nothing to do with nuclear weapons. Like we did not overthrow Gaddafi because of anything to do with nuclear weapons. Of course not, because he didn't have nuclear weapons. So for once, I thought the North Korean nuclear news agency was more honest and open and direct about the example. And that's not the only example. Saddam Hussein abandoned his nuclear aspirations, and his sons were murdered, and he was hung on the gallows in front of his screaming enemies. Again, the logic of nuclear weapons as a stalemating tool, as a guarantee of their security, should not be underestimated. The one thing that we haven't discussed yet that I wonder if others have a view on is, might there be a different way to guarantee North Korea's security? Again, I find it impossible to imagine that North Korea could be convinced that its security is not threatened if it gave up its nuclear weapons, short of something in the future where South Korea has nuclear weapons and they make mutual steps to disarm. In addition, maybe with conventional military drawdown, but I'm not optimistic.
네, 자 이제부터는 이제 청중 질문까지 받을
Yes,
텐데요. 먼저
now we will open the
온라인으로
floor.
질문 들어온 거 있어서 하나
We have one question that we received virtually.
서울 시립대학의
So this is Professor Hwang Ju-an from Seoul University. This question is in English, and I will just tell you the question in Korean. So I think this is relevant to Mr. Peck's comment. So this concept of extended deterrence and the strategy of extended deterrence and its correlation with the nuclear possession of the adversary. Now, to safeguard Seoul, will the U.S. be willing to sacrifice Washington and fight back, counterattack DPRK? So that was the question. Well, if for now the DPRK was to use nuclear weapons against Korea, then the U.S. has one option. It can strike the DPRK. It can do the primary, the first strike, and Washington will no longer be in danger. What I mean by that is this. So the DPRK now has the ability to hit the mainland, but it's not about the second. That's about the secondary strike. So Washington can use nuclear weapons first, and that can be an option by striking the DPRK first. But if the second strike ability is what diminishes on the nuclear umbrella, then what do we need to do? Well, during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union invaded West Europe, then one of the key issues was whether the Allies were able to defend West Europe. But that was because the Soviet Union's secondary strike ability was too strong, too powerful. But for now, the DPRK can hit the US mainland, but it cannot hit back. It does not have the secondary strike ability. And will it be able to secure that ability? Rise of Counterforce is a paper written by Professor Lieber, and you talk about counterforce, rise of counterforce, and you talk about whether the DPRK is survivable. And it is difficult now, and it will be difficult in the foreseeable future. Then that means that the U.S. Extended deterrence will remain intact. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I think I do. I guess the first thought that comes to mind is in the Cold War example of NATO, it's striking, pardon the pun, it's striking that the United States went to such great lengths to make sure that nuclear war would occur. We wanted nuclear weapons to be used immediately in a conventional war with the Soviet Union, despite the fact that the Soviet Union had a secure second strike capability. In other words, once they developed a second strike capability, it made the credibility of our extended deterrence commitment to Europe more difficult, and we doubled down and deployed more weapons, and we did everything possible to make sure that a conventional war would go nuclear, right? And we doubled down after the Soviet Union acquired a second strike. So my view of the North Korean second strike arsenal, retaliatory arsenal, is I don't know where we are now. I know that North Korea is concerned about this and is working toward that. And my view is over time, they will develop and deploy a secure second strike capability. There's a lot of uncertainty here, of course, technological change. The United States is devoting lots of resources to this issue of doing counterforce against North Korea's arsenal. I think the response, I guess the one thing I would just say is that I do think, if you ask me if there's a conventional war tomorrow on the Korean Peninsula, my view is I don't know the answer. Again, I don't have classified knowledge of the U.S. war plans or combined forces war plans. But my hunch, my strong belief is that we will be going after all the North Korean nuclear assets that we can. Because we fear nuclear escalation, because it makes so much sense, we may preemptively try and destroy those weapons. But I don't think that's going to be a nuclear strike. In other words, the United States will be doing lots of conventional counterforce at the very first hours of a war. That may not always be the case. As we begin to lose faith in our ability to find everything and destroy everything, we may abandon that approach. But I think, I'm trying to think about a world in which North Korea has a second strike capability, and I don't think it changes anything about coercive nuclear escalation in a conventional war. In part because the challenge is from the conventional war, not from nuclear weapons itself.
네, 설명 잘 들었습니다. 자, 그러면 오디언스 중에
Thank you very much. We will now entertain questions from the floor. Does anybody have questions or comments from the floor?
없으세요?
No?
없으세요? 제가 눈이 안 보여서 못 보는 걸 수도 있고.
I may not be able to see from the stage, but in that case, I would like to give you some time to think of other questions. During that time, we will move on to the online questions. I would like to give an opportunity for our discussants to share some of their thoughts. I gave each of them 7 minutes, so I'm sure that you do not have enough time to share all that you wanted to share. So if there's anything you want to add, or if there is anything you would like to bring up, please do so. Does any of our discussants wish to take the mic?
또 되게 조용하시네요.
Nobody?
그러면은 어디 계세요?
I actually would like to comment.
네, 뭐 아껴뒀던 코멘트까지는 아니고요.
This is a comment that just came to mind. Professor Lieber and the discussants were engaged in a very lively discussion, and I think the biggest difference in opinion is whether nuclear armament of South Korea is a feasible option. I think that's where the biggest difference is. I'm not sure the other discussants would agree, but Professor Lieber has said that there is an incentive for North Korea to escalate, and it would be more credible for South Korea to have a nuclear deterrent. Even if we accept
정말로 핵무장에
all
나서는 것이
of that?
실질적으로 가능한
Is it a
정책
feasible
옵션인가에
option
대해서는
for South Korea to
정책
do so?
옵션인가는 또 다른
Is it a
질문인 것
feasible
같습니다.
policy option? I think that's a separate issue.
토론자분들께서도 여러 번 언급하셨지만
And
우리가
as
미국과의
mentioned
관계,
by
그리고
some of the
중국을 포함한
discussants,
다른
we have
주변국들과의
relations and
관계를
ties with
고려하지
the
않을
US
수
and
없는
China and other neighboring
상황이고
countries,
그러한
and we must
모든
consider this.
과정에서 있을
There are many
여러 가지 손해나
processes, and there is much to be
문제들을 다
lost
감안하고서라도
in pursuing
핵무장을 하는 것이
nuclear
정말로
armament.
한국에게 가장 좋은 옵션인
And
것인가
given all that can be lost, is nuclear armament truly the best reasonable option for South Korea?
핵무장이라는 좀 극단적인
If
주변 국가를 비롯한 여러 국제사회의
South
반발을
Korea's
불러일으킬 만한 옵션이어야 되는가? 아니면 지금 미국이
only
제공하는 확장 억지
option
신뢰도를
is that I
높이는
think
방안을
it
고려하는
would
쪽으로
not be
나아가야
that
하는가에
feasible.
대해서는
Perhaps
미국에서 많은
another way
토론자분들은
is
후자
to
입장이지
enhance
않은가
the
싶습니다.
nuclear
이러한
deterrence
갭을
of
사실은
the US. And I
줄여나가는
think the
것이 앞으로 이제
discussants, I think, are with me on
미국이 한국
choosing the
정부에
latter option.
제공하는
And I
확장
think
억지
that
신뢰도를
perhaps
어떻게 하면
this
높일 수
is
있는
the type of
것인가를 고려하는
debate
것이
and discussion that is needed. And I think the Korean government and discussants who share my opinion should focus more on finding ways to enhance then the US nuclear deterrent or extended deterrence.
Yeah, thank you. One of the arguments that I made was that I didn't think there were immediate or even short-term, medium-term solutions to improving the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrence commitment. So partly I would turn it back to you and say, like how? Do what? The things that I would think of, nuclear sharing, forward deployment of forces, building up a conventional power, each has a problem that doesn't seem to solve the issue. It's not a question of U.S. capability, right? I mean, look, would I like to have the TLAM-N back, the nuclear cruise, submarine-launched cruise missile? Yes, I actually think it might help. It might help deter North Korean escalation. I think that there's a fundamental problem with a deterrent commitment where it would take 12 hours or 15 hours to fly a nuclear bomb from the United States all the way to the Korean Peninsula. Would I like to see nuclear weapons stored in Guam? Maybe that would help. But this doesn't solve the fundamental problem that nuclear retaliation against North Korean escalation lacks credibility. So I would love to solve the problem in a way that you might, a suggestion that you might have. I don't see that. The whole point of a South Korean nuclear program would be to improve deterrence so that we don't have to find ourselves in this escalatory scenario, right? Isn't that the whole point, is to deter the conflict from escalation from happening in the first place? I think if we agree on one thing, I think everyone would agree that the most important thing is to avoid a conventional war on the Korean Peninsula. So I actually would take if you don't like the idea of a South Korean nuclear arsenal, and which I can understand, and I agree it's a complicated issue, then I think that any South Korean government should double down, should recommit itself to taking any step to avoid a conventional war. That means don't respond to the next provocation, with threats to march on Pyongyang. Do whatever you can to assure North Korea's security. These are very difficult things to do also. I mean, politically, domestically, what South Korean government could guarantee the security of North Korea, a country that every day threatens to turn South Korea into a sea of fire? I mean, that's a problem as well. So I agree with I think I would agree with almost every criticism, the difficulty for South Korea to go it alone, except for maybe the legitimacy part, because I think they can legitimately withdraw from the NPT, and that's what the treaty was created for and it allows for. I would just simply say, what are the alternatives, and why are those better solutions? and I don't think they are better solutions.
오케이. 제가 이제
Yes.
제 조건을 이용해서
So I will use my ability as a moderator to ask a question and make a comment. My comment to Professor Lieber is this. So you kept talking about this message. One premise was this.
이 재래 전력에서
This conventional warfare capability, so compared to ROC-US alliance, the DPRK is inferior in that warfare. So it is bound to lose, which is why it wants to build a nuclear arsenal. And if we were to go into a war, they will try to use nuclear weapons. However, their conventional warfare capability, what is the level of the DPRK? We can ask a question about that. During the Clinton administration in 1993, he thought about preventively striking Yongbyon, but then he did not go with the plan. Why was it difficult to strike Yongbyon? Well, a war can break out, but then ROC-US alliance will win. But then the problem is that it is too costly. It is a victory, but you cannot be happy with that victory because it costs too much. If you calculate all the expenses, well, North Korea, without using nuclear weapons, it can actually cause great damage to the ROC-US alliance. So the conventional deterrence, maybe it has enough conventional war deterrence. So my question or comment to Professor Lieber is this. And to the four discussants, this is one question. The next panel, I think the panel next to us is talking about the initiative, the audacious initiative of the Yoon Suk-yeol government. And, well, should we refrain from building nuclear arsenal because we are afraid of economic sanctions from our allies? Well, I'm now authoring a book and I research history a lot. And the US at one point had some allies, but actually, history does not tell us any cases where the US abandoned an ally because that ally went nuclear. Well, the UK, Israel, France, or South Africa. Well, actually, it actually wanted to stop the country from building nuclear arsenal, but that involved apartheid and so on, so it was a difficult question. Anyways, so you talked about, well, we may be subject to economic sanctions, we may turn like the DPRK because the US will abandon us. Do you really think that will be the case if we were to build nuclear arsenal? But first, Professor Lieber, the level of the DPRK's conventional warfare capability.
It's a good question. The question, as I take it, is despite any weaknesses in North Korea's conventional capabilities, doesn't it have enough to deter at the conventional level any kind of South Korean Combined Forces Command aggression against the North? Taking it a step further, maybe that means there would never be a conventional war. I hope you're right. I think very poorly of the North Korean conventional capability. Again, with the exception of the artillery threat to Seoul, which is what the US and South Korea are working on day and night to counter that threat. The idea that North Korea, it may have the 5th largest or 6th largest, I forget what it is these days, in terms of numbers of conventional military power. It is a 4th rate, 5th rate. It is a terribly equipped conventional fight. It's not a fighting force. It would be a slaughter on the battlefield if the Combined Forces Command were to fight North Korea. You know, again, the soldier who came across the DMZ, you know, in terms of health of frontline forces, it was depressing to me that this is the condition of the military. So I think it's quite poor. I'm less convinced that it would deter any conventional aggression. Again, let's imagine an incident in which 100 South Koreans die because of a North Korean provocation. It's going to be very difficult for South Korean policymakers to do nothing in response to that. And I fear where tit for tat goes from there. I worry about a conventional war, perhaps more than my colleagues, which is good news because you probably know more than I do about this. Just one last word about the 1994 agreed framework. And I think at the time I thought it was I was glad that we avoided conventional conflict. Apparently Bill Clinton was preparing to act militarily when he got the call that an agreement had been negotiated. Part of me wishes we could go back in time and replay this. If in the future this ends up in a nuclear war, we're going to wish that the United States had stopped North Korea in the past, but that's impossible to imagine. And when I think about my own views of what the United States should do to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, I don't want to fight any war to stop Iran from getting. I would rather have Iran get nuclear weapons than fight a conventional war to prevent them from acquiring them. And there is no scenario in which a U.S. military strike against Iran is a small pinprick. It's a major operation, and it won't stop Iran from wanting nuclear weapons. It will only make it want nuclear weapons more. And that same scenario probably would have played out with North Korea. Unless we had eliminated the regime, pursued regime change, it would not have deterred them from seeking nuclear weapons. It would have emboldened them and reinforced their logic for why nuclear weapons are a terrific tool of stalemate and great for your security of your country.
제 코멘트에 대해서 혹시 말씀해 주실 분?
예, 두 가지만 잠깐.
I would like to raise 2 points about your comment to the discussants. I would first like to touch upon an alternative solution. Professor Lieber has stated that, or rather, it talks about a situation where a conventional war escalates possibly into a nuclear war. And just as you mentioned, I guess the best solution in that case is to avoid a conventional war at all costs. And in a conventional warfare, and this is said by many Koreans, even if a nuclear weapon is not used, as Professor Lee mentioned earlier, because it is in the distance of North Korean artillery, the moment the barrage begins, it is likely that the country will be paralyzed and there will be great tragedy. Even if nuclear weapons are not used, the situation that unfolds will be no different. And that is what a lot of Koreans think. And the second point that I want to make has to do with Professor Lee's comments. Basically, if we were to build a nuclear arsenal, we would have to think about the costs entailed, and we would also have to think about the benefits that we would gain. So we would need to gauge the cost versus benefits. And we would have to carry out a thorough analysis of what the cost would be, and we would have to definitely consider that. But at the same time, we should also think about the benefits. What will we gain from building nuclear arsenal? So we need to carry out a thorough analysis for the latter as well.
결국에는 억지력 강화 부분인데.
The benefits we would gain would be stronger nuclear or extended deterrence. Then we would have to gauge just by how much the deterrence will become stronger. So we need to evaluate the current situation then. What is the extended deterrence, or what is the deterrence of the conventional military at this point? It's not zero. I believe that we do have significant deterrence capability. And as mentioned by Professor Lieber, I agree with you, or rather I don't agree with you when you say that nuclear weapons are the best deterrent to nuclear weapons. I do agree that nuclear weapons are the strongest tool for deterrence. I agree with you on that point, but I don't agree that nuclear weapons are the only way to deter nuclear weapons. I think there are other ways. In other words, there is what we could call a level of deterrence. So we can strengthen our deterrence with nuclear arsenal. And of course, the nuclear arsenal will enhance our deterrence. But the cost entailed to the increase, that is what we have to look at. Will the costs be higher or lower for the deterrence that is enhanced? So I guess we would have to look at the level of deterrence that we achieve ultimately. Professor Chung, do you have any ending comments, last comments? No, not particularly, but I would like to mention 2 points before we close. Professor Lee explained a scenario during his comments, and you talked about Busan. You said that North Korea might strike Busan, and that was a bit sad for me to hear. And Dr. Kim raised skepticism about the benefits of a nuclear arsenal. And Professor Lieber has pointed out the uncertainty regarding strengthening extended deterrence. And we also heard about the side effects of nuclear armament and that impact it has on an alliance. And I think that each of these opinions is viable. I think that this issue has not been discussed in depth for a long time in the Korean government and among Korean experts. So I think that it's very vital that we have this discussion at gatherings like this. I think that the discussions today here were invaluable in that sense. Dr. Alexandrova, do you have any closing comments?
Focus on the issue of denuclearization of North Korea. I would agree that South Korean nuclear armament may be the least bad option if it did not come with significant costs. So we have a number of bad options, and all of them have some kind of cost that that South Korea will have to pay, and all of them have close to zero probability of success. Then I would say that the less costly options may be preferable to the one that will incur significant damage to the South Korean economy, maybe to the South Korean security. So in this sense, I would think that we need a very strict cost-benefit analysis when we talk about South Korean nuclear armament, and that other options may be better just in this sense. Thank you.
백선우 박사님 마무리 발언 부탁드립니다.
Yes, Professor Peck, yes, this was an opportunity to learn a lot.
저 스스로도 이제 알지 못하게 이제 한국의 핵무장화라는 주장에 대해서 일단 부정적으로
불가능할 거라고 생각하고 unwittingly, I was very negative toward the idea of building nuclear arsenal in South Korea.
이 문제에 대해서 조금 더
So I guess I was biased in a way, but it was an opportunity to learn. So thank you very much for that. And last but not least, Professor Lieber, closing remark.
Yeah, thank you. I again agree that this is exactly the kind of debate that should take place. It's a debate that doesn't even happen in the United States as much as it should. U.S. nuclear policy People just don't like to discuss these matters because they're pretty grim and pretty terrible. But the last thing I'll say about costs and benefits is exactly right. You need to calculate costs and benefits, even if it's difficult. What I would emphasize is that we can't compare the costs to the status quo, the current situation, because the reason to even consider a South Korean nuclear arsenal is because of the fear of a much darker time, a much worse world in which nuclear weapons have been used against South Korea or against the United States or against allies. So it's even more difficult than just comparing current costs and benefits, but comparing costs now versus potential costs later. It's extremely difficult. Thank you very much for having me here. I've enjoyed the discussion.
자, 제가 이제 마무리 발언.
Yes, I will now
통일부에서 이제
wrap
후원해
up.
주시고 우리 통일연구원에서 많이
So this meeting is sponsored by the Ministry of Unification, and it is co-organized by KINU and Korea University Peace and Democracy Institute. And I believe they are very smart institutes because I told you that next door they're talking about the audacious initiative of the Yoon Suk-yeol government, and they are looking into Plan A and Plan B. Well, that's Plan A, and I think that we are talking about Plan B here in this room. Of course, it would be great if North Korea was to denuclearize itself. However, if it does not do so, then what do we need to do? What options do we have? And I think that today was a great opportunity to look into the options. And I really look forward to seeing more discussions like this one. With that, we'll close session 3-2. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end, and thank you very much, everyone. Well, thank you and goodbye.